Good afternoon, everyone. Just making a quick response to one of my viewers who took the time to respond, and apparently she's been reviewing the videos, and one of her concerns, I think, is with the scamming, lotto scamming to be specific, that's going on in Jamaica, and she says she's an advocate, and her channel is Boo Boo Bear 6487. So good afternoon, Boo Boo Bear 6487. I'm responding directly to your concerns about lotto scamming and the fact that you have deducted or deduced that the community, and I'm not so sure what you mean by community. It brings a couple of ambiguous questions from me, but you said the community acceptance of the behavior. It seemed to be there's a community acceptance of the behavior. So I think and interpreting that to mean that you're suggesting that the community, and I'm assuming the Jamaican community, is accepting of the behavior of lotto scamming. Now, if that's too broad, then I'll go to say a certain sector of the Jamaican community is accepting lotto scamming as quote unquote, and if they're accepting it, it means they would be more or less saying it's a legit action on the part of these scammers. So I have that to deal with. And then the first suggestion you made was a lot of these lotto scammers seem to be using the excuse as for doing it as retribution. So I'm going to address that. I'm also going to add in there not just retribution, but repatriation, not reparation. Sorry. I've heard that argument as well, and even though you didn't raise it or suggest it, I'm going to address both, all three of your concerns. Now, firstly, off the bat, scamming is not only illegal, it's morally and ethically wrong. So even if the state had permitted it by some unusual law, by virtue of jurisdiction and sovereignty, which is not the case in Jamaica, it's illegal. It's illegal, as I said, politically, morally, ethically. Anybody that tries to take advantage of anybody is committing a crime. That's a violation. And if you've ever been robbed or people, even insult you in public and abuse you because of your race, color, or creed, your gender, and try to take advantage of that. I don't know what kind of advantage they'll be getting, or acceptance, depending on where they are. But certainly, from my perspective and from the perspective of the vast majority of people I know, and the vast majority of people I know include a large percentage of Jamaicans. In fact, I know significantly more Jamaicans than any other persons on the planet. So I can categorically state that Jamaicans, regardless of whether they are in the diaspora, in the US, South America, the UK, Europe, Africa, the vast majority of Jamaicans are hardworking, honest people who don't support crimes of any kind. So from that perspective, if I'm understanding community to mean a body of Jamaicans accepting that level of criminality, no, it's not. That's not the case, and I have verifiable proof of that from my own experience, because as you may well imagine, I frequent the island, or used to frequent the island before this whole COVID thing hit, for the last 40, 50 years. In fact, 60 something years to be exact. And I've never come across anybody on the island. Well, let me not say anybody. Anybody of that I know that was accepting of scamming. I know I met one gentleman once, sort of a pseudo politician in the Montego Bay area, and I went to it was, call it a town hall meeting. It was a meeting headed up by the National Planning, Development and Planning Agency, NEPA, and they had it at Granville in Montego Bay, and there were quite a few community leaders there. And I recall one particular individual got up and suggested that a good product for the tourism market, and Montego Bay and Jamaica is heavily tourism when it comes to the economy. His suggestion was that the island or the tourism industry could exploit the whole lotto situation, scamming, by taking tours to view the houses or property these people had built up from scamming people. Of course, there are a number of real problematic issues with that, because again, they'll be taking them into areas. Predominantly, the idea was to take them into what we call informal settlement areas, squatting areas that people have built up their homes. And unfortunately, and this has been happening or has happened in the past, including with I've heard comments from U.S. law enforcement suggesting that because the vast majority of people who squat in those areas, as in Jamaica they say, capture land. And I say squatting, believe it or not, is not an illegal activity. Some people try to get some moral standing out of that by discouraging persons or dissuading them to say, oh, you're squatting, and try to humiliate people. But squatting is actually a legal process in every country that I know of, including the UK and the US. And the reason for that is simply to allow citizens, and it doesn't restrict who or which level of citizenship or the socio-economic background of those persons. But what it does say, and the justification of that, is that if there is property sitting in the jurisdiction that is underutilized, basically idle, and there's nobody there laying claim to it, and somebody moves on to it, takes control, possesses that property for a specific period of time, then they legally have a right under the Constitution to take or apply for ownership of that property or title to the property. So it's quite legal. So the suggestion by a lot of people to looking down on people who squat and capture land as an illicit activity, that's a no-no. It's wrong, and they're not committing any crimes. And in fact, in the Jamaica area of New York, I remember in the late 80s and early 90s, a large number of commercial property was sitting idle and boarded up. And of course, US business people or citizens just left them boarded up for and making the areas derelict and depressed. And there was a large percentage of the Sikh Indian population who went in and started to capture those buildings. So it's and they converted them and turned a lot of them into business places and stuff. And so it actually improved the community. Now these informal areas have a problem with them because government, and again I'll point to the whole mismanagement of the state and state resources. Government, instead of going in and regulating those areas to avoid crime and all of that within those areas, have neglected to do that. And then it's also a common practice in Jamaica for government to toy with those persons, giving them the impression that they've committed some crime, but the government is going to give them relief by getting them their titles. And typically the Constitution, they really don't need the government to do it. And once they've held that property in Jamaica for 12 years, and it used to be less at one point, it used to be 7 point something years, and they're in full control for 12 years now, though. Nobody can move them legally, that is, not even the government. So instead of going in and putting in infrastructure and working out some kind of revenue from them by allowing them to pay taxes and putting in revenue, government ties with them because of election processes and needing votes. So they would give people the impression, you vote for me, I'm going to get you those things. And after they vote for them, nothing happens, and they play that cycle. So what we've had developing now, instead of people who have gone in and built homes being regularized, government has caused communities like that to become depressed and what we call ghettos. And if you drive through those communities, they have substantial homes. Now, the typical Jamaican who works and works hard build to live in a nice house, and they work hard and they build that home through sweat equity, meaning they go in and they work the concrete, the blocks, and they through sweat equity they build nice homes. And they're not criminals. There are people who go out and work honestly and use their money wisely to build substantial homes. And I'm raising that issue because when you compare what government is doing in terms of housing for the housing market in Jamaica in association with the housing trust, you'll find housing trusts and those formal developers building homes that, when you compare them to what people build for far less, you wonder why government doesn't just give those persons the funds to go build their homes on those lands, because they ultimately build better homes, more substantial homes that serve the family's purpose. Now, I'm making all of that point to say one of the problematic issues that was raised when this gentleman came up with this idea about using the scamming as a tourism product, and that to take people through those neighborhoods would be giving people the impression that the vast majority of people who live in those communities are scammers, and they're not. Like criminals everywhere else, it's a handful of people who form the scamming or does scamming in Jamaica. I mean, it's relative, but it's certainly not hundreds of thousands of people or a significant percentage of the population. It's still too many, one too many, but the fact is, if that was to happen and anybody was to consider that crazy idea of putting people through, put them on tour bus and drive around and show them homes, that's it, these are the homes that the scammers built, that would be misinformation. And unfortunately, it was reported at one point that the FBI took a special interest in Jamaica because when they drove into those squatting communities, they saw substantial homes. Unfortunately, and the stereotypic approach of law enforcement then was that the vast majority of people who live in those areas are scammers, and that's not true, as I have said. In those areas, scammers do live, some of those areas, but in more formal, upscale neighborhoods, middle-class neighborhoods, scammers have taken their dollars and cents and have bought property in those areas, built substantial homes, they have opened businesses and all of that. So not to justify it, that's where the money laundering thing would come in, and law enforcement needs to deal with it. However, again, the problem with it is local law enforcement, the government, and even businesses, they benefit substantially from these scammers. And so they keep their mouths shut or allow the process without really shutting them down, because they can. So for example, people scamming and building homes, they have to purchase the material from the hardware suppliers. And of course, that's big money for these suppliers. The products that purchased to build the homes, and most people who build homes in Jamaica build it themselves. They're their own contractors. So these persons building their homes, they hire an architect to draw the plan. They pay a fee at the government offices for the home, the whatever permit fees are required. They pay truckers to transport their goods and services. And so when those people do get in funds, because one of the hallmarks of a Jamaican is that they love to own their homes, they love nice things. So these scammers build grand mansions, they rent in the best neighborhoods, they buy the most expensive cars, and I hear they throw big parties. And in fact, it is said that a lot of the money also goes into sponsoring artists who produce music, and so to a percentage of the population that either are self-employed, there is a real economic benefit to having scammers take people's assets or money and then spend it in the economy, which again is not something that one can really prevent, because even in the United States, for example, we know drug dealers and all of them, they pretty much do the same thing. Corrupt politicians, they collect money, and they do the same thing. They buy the mansions, they buy the cars, they live high, they throw the parties. So not saying that's specific to Jamaica, I'm just saying the economy benefits from having those scammers. And so the community that I think you might be mentioning, it's not that they support scamming, but because there's a real economic benefit to them, and they themselves aren't involved in the scamming, they keep their mouths shut and avoid any kind of conflict, because there's an issue with that too. You get into conflict with these people. They have guns that come in largely from the US market. They take these guns and they will hurt you. And it's a common practice for that. It's again, for example, it's no different in the US or Mexico or areas where they have large gangs and gang affiliation with criminal activity and drugs. These gangsters, whether they lotto scammers or drug dealers, they get involved with turf war, and innocent people get hurt. Innocent people are intimidated, and they fear these persons. A mere presence of them in the community or in the supermarket or on the street, and people say know them or they look alike, they look like scammers, or how they dress. And again, we have to be very careful, because the same fashion they're wearing, other people wear it, and they might be scammers, but generalizing. And that's what happens when we stereotype people, is that innocent people get mistaken. But that said, a lot of these scammers or criminals or drug dealers or corrupt individuals who deal with these people are a part of that underground economy, are benefiting. So from the perspective of community, as you mentioned, those persons in that community, it's not that they accept it as a legitimate activity, is that they keep their mouths shut, they mind their own business, because they're getting the benefit of cash and kind, which is now another issue for another campaign against immorality in society, because most of us have been trained and educated to say, as long as you're making money, the means justifies the end, and therefore people will sacrifice themselves and their souls and their families and friends for this illicit money, the illicitly gained money from scamming. And they don't care if it's their grandmother they're trying to scam from. The fact is, as long as they're making the money, they'll do it. And I'll make that statement about the grandmothers, because these scammers have been known, like other criminals, to hurt their family members, hurt their friends, so-called friends, their relatives, because of their activities. They'll take out one out of sheer jealousy or competition. So again, the community that you might be addressing is not as significant as you suggest, or I wouldn't say suggest because you didn't do that. The question though does suggest the acceptance of that criminal activity by the community, not the greater Jamaican community, not even the community of individuals who live within the neighborhoods that they share with these persons. It's just that because of intimidation and lack of effective law enforcement action on the part of the government, why people stay intimidated and keep their mouths shut. And again, it's not only Jamaican businesses that are benefiting from this, it's the financial sector. For example, Western Union makes a ton of money off scamming, and governments, including the FBI and any law enforcement agencies that are dealing with this, need to focus on money transfer services like Western Union and the banks, because in reality, these scammers who are Jamaican based, island based, have no passports, have no visas, have no means of getting off the island to come to the US. They have the money coming down there to them through places like Western Union. And the problem with that is that Western Union in certain areas they've implemented certain things like saying people might need two or have need of two identification. When you're getting there, ask you all kind of evasive questions which violate your privacy, and that's affecting legitimate, honest, law-abiding people. But they claim that's the policy they are putting in place to find out who's doing what. And in the reality, they ask those persons questions, or anybody to ask questions, but there is no effort to hold on to those people and their funds because they can't do it legally anyway. It would be illegal for any bank or Western Union to hold on to people's money if they suspect that they're committing a scamming crime. So again, there is the problem with the scamming is that law enforcement is unable to put effective measures in place to deal with it. And that creates again the problem of having legitimate businesses within that underground economy actually operating in conjunction with that underground economy, delivering the ill-gain products of the scammers and the scamming. So again, the question of communities is rather complex, and all the people in there aren't complicit or complacent by virtue of their trade and business activity and by virtue of commerce within the economy. Their services are taken advantage of. In short, let me simplify that. Imagine a scammer going down to the city center of any one of these towns. They see a taxi, they hire the taxi, they take the taxi all over the place, pays the taxi. You can't blame the taxi man for taking a fare. At the same time, the government can't come in and close down the taxi man for doing that. The scammers, the government can arrest him for spending money that he has. And though there are some questionable laws that have been passed in Jamaica which violate the constitutional right of people, I think it's very difficult for them to find out who's scamming and who isn't, even though they might suspect until you have the proof. The only time we have the proof if it's coming from the US side or the persons who were scammed that can provide evidence, which is what I think is taking place now. So persons like yourself, Boo Boo Bear 6487, who are advocates for the scammed or the victims, I think what we need to do is not merely try to interface the community or the general population or of the islands, especially Jamaica, into the scamming business by saying they're accepting it because these scammers live amongst them. What we need to do is come up with solutions. How are we going to prevent the thing from happening in the first place? And apart from the fact that communication is made easy now because of phones and and the internet and you name it. There must be ways for us to put a hold on or stave off scamming that takes advantage of especially senior persons. And that's again a more complex question, but the solutions are there. So as an advocate, I would start looking at not treating the victims, but let's prevent the victims from being created in the first place. So the other thing you raised now was the question of retribution. Criminals throughout history from time immemorial have always justified their action, or tried to, even though the justification is illegit and has very little standing or substance. So the people who were pirates in the Caribbean, they justify ripping off or robbing Spain because Spain and the English were at war. All right, so that was their justification. But thievery is thievery. You were robbing somebody, you're stealing persons. Europeans justify their illegal slave trade by saying they were taking Africans to Christianize them and bring them into conformity with, I guess, Western norms of civilization. That was one of the excuses. Of course, we know what took place there. In the South, after the Civil War, we had a lot of ex-military servicemen who were in the Confederate Army, and maybe even the Northern Army. They became, a lot of them became gangs. They would raid persons' property and estate and rob them. I think Quantrell Raiders was one group. I'm saying one group because that's a name that popped into my head. But a lot of famous and infamous persons were put into U.S. folklore as heroes, even though themselves were criminals. And they tried to justify it and robbing people and shooting them up by saying, well, we're taking retribution for what happened during the Civil War, even though they were largely responsible for the mayhem that took place. And I'll refer to Billy the Kid, Jesse James, and his brother, you name it. A whole bunch of these persons who were involved in criminal activity, American folklore, made them into heroes, even though they were criminals. So they were accepted by a few people who made them into popular folklore. But the fact is, the vast majority of people, I would think, throughout the U.S., whether they were from the North or the South, were themselves not criminals, or they did not support the raiding and the murdering and killing of people after the war. And most people wanted to get on with their lives. So this isn't a simple question. In terms of retribution, I don't know what these guys would be giving payback for. If it's not, they can't claim it's because of historical events like slavery and colonization, because the vast majority of them grew up in a world where they weren't experiencing that. The vast majority of persons who are involved in this kind of activity were born long after all of that ended and we became independent. And though there were massive economic issues that we still have to deal with, or there are, retribution for whom or for what? And a lot of them who are scamming are people, young men who have gone to some of the high schools in Jamaica that are well reputed. These are top high schools that went there, and instead of performing, they made a fool of themselves. Some of them graduated with, I guess, a good grades, but instead of trying to find ways to get a higher education, the money and the thievery and the crime was much more attractive. So retribution is definitely not something that can be supported. The Jamaican people would not support that, because the vast majority of Jamaicans don't even know anything about their political history, apart from the fact they know, or we know, that we were captives, dragged out of Africa, and they tried to make us into slaves. And many of us weren't slaves because we didn't accept it. We fought and burned plantations, which was legit. That was legitimate. That was retribution. But after independence, and we are getting our act together and still are struggling, these young people wouldn't qualify or fall into that grouping that could say, we're taking revenge against whom, by the way? Because we're not talking about the British government or any colonial power on the island. And the fact is, North American citizens or US citizens, even before there was a United States and after there was a United States, didn't play any role in the oppression of our people through colonialism. Yes, people get upset about capitalism sometimes and the effects of it. But again, in Jamaica's case, these guys who are committing all these crimes, they didn't study any of that. They're not knowledgeable about it. They don't know their history. So they couldn't be talking about retribution for what? From whom? It's not justified. Because again, they go about and they steal from people. Because that's what it is. They violate people's rights and their property and then try to justify that. I don't see it. And Jamaicans across the board condemn that, as a matter of fact. They don't like scammers. So the misconception out there is that a large percentage of Jamaicans condone the business of scamming. They don't. Another large misconception that the world held for decades, and this is just to support my position, that the vast majority of people would not support scamming on the basis of retribution, because that's not what Jamaicans are about. The vast majority of Jamaicans are hardworking, building their own economy, raising their families. If they have an opportunity to migrate, when they migrate, they get there and they become model citizens, most of them. That is not to say a few of them don't get into criminal activity like every other ethnic or cultural group. You have persons from all nations who live in the US or in the UK or wherever. They get there and a lot of them go into crime and criminal activity. Some say they're forcing it because of opportunity. Again, I go back when in the past, when a vast majority of people came into the country, they came there and they took bad jobs, bad paying jobs that nobody else wanted, but they pooled their assets and their resources and they built substantial assets and income and built a good lifestyle for themselves. So again, it's not justifiable. And as I said, criminals find ways to try to justify their activity, but it's unjustified. I think it's just a desire to live like, let's say, people in the movies, gangsters in the movies, and those things are celebrated, and the mass media and Hollywood glamorize crimes and criminal activity. Because if you look at what's coming out of Hollywood now, the vast majority of popular movies are movies where the stars or the main characters are criminals committing crime. But in the movies, they make these persons look like heroes. And so the media, in terms of the movie industry, entertainment industry, does play a role in creating these scammers. And in fact, I would submit that a significant number of these scammers are influenced by Hollywood, US movie market, European movie markets, because it's highly, I mean, in terms of communication, we probably have communication now that's so much easier that these people see all of this happening, they see the guns, they know how they could get them because all they do is replicate what they're learning from TV. And I would also submit that as an advocate, one of the things that should be done is for persons who are dealing with this to be honest with how this process started. Lotto scamming did not start in Jamaica or in Guyana or Ghana or Nigeria, but that is what the US press or the Western press has glamorized. Lotto scamming was going on in the US. They used to call it, well, it's still lotto now. It's a sweepstake. It's the same thing. Sweepstake scamming or the travel scamming. I've been targeted multiple times in the 80s and 90s with sweepstake scamming and the same duplicate that these people in the Caribbean are using. So it's not they created it. They learn from what's out there and they delved in it and they take advantage of people. So advocates must start looking at the source of these things, and just like how you have labeling going on movies to encourage people not to have young people watch this, or maybe we should be doing that with violent movies that have those kinds of things that's highly influential on people or young people who now justify it because that's the way of the world. That's how things work. And again, it's the same thing we see. And it's reality. That's what goes on in Western society that's sold to people like that. And they're told we must emulate Western values. And when you're making money, it doesn't matter at the end of the day how you got it. It's what you do with it and legitimize it. And quite a few high-ranking families in the US, were involved in quote-unquote illegal activity then. So it's not a matter of Jamaicans accepting of it. That's not the case. Just like the rest of the world, when you see people being taken advantage of, everybody gets upset. Well, most people gets upset. The people who are benefiting from it, of course, they justify it. A thief is always going to be a thief, and he's going to justify why he's robbing people, So that's basically what I have to say. I mentioned reparations as well, because I've heard the argument, this is reparation for what Europeans did. But again, in enslaving African peoples. But again, it's not justified because these people are talking about reparations. They're not seeking to get legitimate reparations by going through the political process. If they need to file lawsuits, find those companies that were engaged in slavery, because historically there are still companies that have a lineage from the days of slavery who benefited from the slave trade or other illegal trade. Sue them, go after them in the courts, because they have international laws and treaty that says there are no statute of limitations on these crimes. So that's how you get reparations. You work out with government entities and you raise political issues that become part of the legislative process, and so that we can get legitimate compensation to make up for the many ills that took place that pretty much marginalize a whole nation of people. And I say marginalized because they were thrown off plantations and they were expected, well, maybe they weren't, because the general concept of racism as practiced by a lot of ignorant people who seem not to understand that racism doesn't work for them, it doesn't work for us, and it's not good for anybody. But they still profess it. During the Jim Crow era, they found every excuse to limit persons' progress. And because of those illegal activities, we've had many laws passed. What we need to do now is recognize that We need to throw money behind making up for those ill treatments that our people got. And just like when they incarcerated the Japanese during World War II, it was wrong, but they compensated them for doing that. And rightly so, a lot of them lost property, the psychological trauma. So you can imagine a bunch of people who were enslaved for almost 400 years, if not more, then being thrown out without any kind of resources. And a lot of them were supposed to accept that. And I said, reparations is coming. Some people have started to discuss it, like California. And because they realize if we don't do something that's going to repair the damage that's done to these persons, because the psychological damage is still with us. And it's generational. And until we can let persons know that this was imposed and the trauma has not been dealt with. I mean, even now we recognize that military persons who have gone to war and engaged in defending this nation, when they come back, they're traumatized, and it has detrimental effects not only for them but people around them. And we've recognized that they need help. So can you imagine a nation of people, millions and millions and millions of Africans, descendants, or blacks, if they want to use the term, in the Americas or elsewhere where they were enslaved. And I'm saying America, in America, not just North America, not just the Caribbean, but South America, Central America, where they were enslaved. They were told by virtue of their color they weren't deserving to be here or there. And that trauma is still there. African Americans and black people in the US still worry about being stopped by the police. There's a major fear when you see a cop behind you because you don't know what is going to happen and you haven't done any crime. I've been pulled over because I'm driving a Lexus. I remember in New York, I drove a Lexus from Texas, and persons were telling me don't drive through this particular part of Louisiana or Mississippi, one of them places, because I had gone down to Texas. I drove through Texas to come back, right? So I went anyway, and so said, so done. Dark of night, cop trailing me in an unmarked car. When he saw that I recognized that I was being followed, he eventually flashed me, pulled me over, and told me to follow him. And he took me off the highway to some little back-a-wall town in a garage. And he just stripped down that car, ripped it apart. And when they were ripping up the car apart, he finally went to one of the back seats and he said, "Oh, you found something. The color is white and it looks suspicious." So I said to him, "All right. First of all, as you can see on the car, it bears a dealer's license because my cousin was a dealer. I purchased a vehicle from him. I was driving back to New York. I purchased the vehicle at a dealer and I gave him the document when I purchased it. I said, I'm heading back to New York, taking it to New York. So if you have a problem with the car and what's in there, contact the dealer." So the cop was like, "Oh, it's a dealer's car?" I said, "You didn't see the plates?" I said, "Yeah, it's a dealer's car. I'm actually delivering the car. I bought it." No, sorry, I didn't buy it. I went to buy a car. He had the car to sell. I told him, well, I could probably sell it in New York for him. So he gave me the car to drive up, which is what I did, and sold it in New York. But just to say that we have been going through all of that trauma, and yet the majority of us have not taken any kind of physical or military action to correct what most people would have done, because we recognize that's not going to solve the problem. We need real solutions to real problems, and like most people, all we're looking to do is live the best lifestyle we can. So again, repatriation, why am I saying repatriation? We have the right to go back to Africa, yes, or anywhere else. But we're talking about reparations. So reparations, while due, would still not justify what these people are doing because it doesn't deliver what reparation means or should mean. And they're not doing it in any way that's going to contribute to the community. They're not getting money and then distribute it. That's what a reparation thing would entail. You go get the money, like a Robin Hood, and then you distribute it to the victims. They're not doing that. They're selfish. They go get the money, and they live like wild gangsters and shoot up the place, kill people, murder people, put the fear of God in everybody else around them. So anybody that has the impression that Jamaicans support that kind of thing, that's totally unjustified, that kind of conclusion. We don't support it. We never support it. And I'll submit to you, Boo Boo Bear 6487, that advocates like yourself should get together with other advocates, get together with people like me and persons in the Caribbean, in Jamaica, build a bridge and put solutions together that stop the crime from happening before it happens. Because if we come up with scholarships and force these persons to become educated into professions that are needed globally, that they could migrate and go work and make money, and educate them that there are other ways to move strategically to build wealth that they can hold on to, that they won't lose when they go to prison, then we'll see a diminishing of that level of crime. And that would be contributing to reparations. That would be the retribution, compensation, by helping to rebuild the mentality, the psychological trauma that many of these people go through, and the poverty that they exist in. And again, it's going to take a unified front where people don't just distance themselves and say, oh, this is a Jamaica problem. No, it's not. It's scamming started in the US as far as we know. There was much more scamming in the US, and probably still is, in fact still is, than in the Caribbean. Because in fact, one branch of the scamming procedure, which involves kids doing research on senior citizens, then showing up at their homes, knocking on the door, and say, hey grandma, it's so and so, and then rip off the lady or the person there. That's happening in real time in the US. But we tend to try to cover up those things and give the world the impression that the scamming is only happening in Jamaica or in Nigeria and all of that. It happens there, but it happens here as well. And what we need is a policy that will fix those issues. In the Caribbean, it's going to be easier to solve the scamming issues, because again, if you create opportunities educationally, jobs, help, strategies to move people out of poverty, giving them a real living wage, then we'll see a reduction in that. The other major move to eliminate scamming in Jamaica is to fix the corruption, which is my pet peeve, because it's the corruption by politicians and persons who make a lot of money out of the politics that force these persons into poor communities with lack of opportunities while they're fattening their pockets. And unfortunately, until it gets really bad, the US law enforcement typically doesn't deal with them unless they find they're connected in some way to drugs, or they're moving lots of US dollars to launder it, which again is you're trying to fix the problem when it has already become mature and cancerous to a point it can be fixed easily. So dealing with corruption in the Caribbean and in Jamaica amongst politicians is going to help to solve the whole scamming issue. And that's just a fact. So as an advocate, I would lobby the US government to pay greater attention to politicians who are involved in scamming the local economy and the local people in Jamaica, the businesses who are involved in scamming. And once you shut down the scamming, then those other persons, low-lying people, low-level people who are involved in scamming are going to recognize that if those guys at the top are being locked up and locked down for scamming, and not scamming but defrauding people through corruption, then they will also take heed. A major institution that the US must target and deal with, it's the courts. The Jamaica courts, especially, I have my bad experiences in the Supreme Court, the vast majority of it. And I say that because I have evidence that, which I also gave to the FBI, by the way, and they're not doing anything. And the scamming or the corruption in the court, where they're trying to defraud people of their assets. And those people are living in the ghettos and the scamming areas and communities where people know who are scammers. They see those people, they know them because they work for them. They are involved in the hit squads. They get people and then they go into court, and these judges find ways to get them out by breaking the law themselves or breaking the rules. And whether they come through an attorney or not, it's just a fact. They have attorneys there who work with judges and pull these corrupt scams to keep criminals on the street. So the US law enforcement must take a serious look at that. And as a lobbyist, I wouldn't say a lobbyist, but an advocate, Boo Boo Bear 648, you and your colleagues need to pressure the US government to tackle corruption in governments abroad, especially Jamaica, if we want to deal with the scamming out of Jamaica. Because then that stops the guns from coming in from the US, it stops the drugs from coming in from South America and Jamaica and other Caribbean islands being used as transshipment ports and then coming to the US. So the apex, the point, the beginning of dealing with the scamming is dealing with corruption. Thank you. I hope I was of some help. And please, share the video with your colleagues, and let's, I said, build a mutual working relationship to really solve these problems, as opposed to people just merely talking and talking and talking. There are real solutions there. And again, throwing money behind dealing with the scamming is one way of helping. All right, have a good one, and I'm looking forward to a response. Take care.